Yeah, and so the notion of economic change and the development that is concomitant with uh, the paradigm shift that occurs during that period gives way to a particular structure um, in the theory of economics, which is, of course, known, as we would have come to understand by now, as the marginal analysis. Now, what you have covered within your first labor course encapsulates this notion of marginality and marginal analysis, and in particular utilizes the partial static equilibrium framework. Now, what you usually study is a particular framework that has been provided, birthed out of a historical context. And note that the what is known as the first generation of the neoclassicals or the marginalists did not contribute the framework that you currently use in Lab Economics 1. And the reason why the course is set up the way that it is for you to understand, not generally for me to rehash the entire course that you would have done, Lab Economics 1, but for you to have an understanding of the fact that when analyzing labor and when analyzing interactions of social beings, and this factor of production, which is known in economics as labor, that it is not something that can easily or very nicely or neatly map into the partial static equilibrium framework. And there are a number of problems that are associated with that framework from the fundamental. And so, what we'll endeavor to do this afternoon is a very basic overview, very cursory, of what that period entailed, um, and what is known as the transition to neoclassical economics as we know it today, and the notion of marginal analysis and the fact that this marginal analytical framework, which had been originally provided, was extended by a number of authors. And so everyone can see the screen here that we have, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
good, good, good. Right. So I'll commence with this. So why initially should was the marginalist revolution extended? Now, as we would have mentioned in the introductory class, of course, Leon Walras, Carl Menger, and Stanley Jevons played a very important role in us establishing the first framework associated with neoclassicism. However, they applied the notion of marginal analysis almost exclusively to what is known, of course, as the theory of demand, and they ignored the theory of supply. And therefore, they could not fully elaborate on the behaviors which were occurring in the market, and naturally, a market comprises demand and supply. Now, what the reason why they did this is not because they wanted to create some construct that was abstract of supply, but their models generally assume that supply was given based on the structure of the society and based on the existing population. And the fact that the resource allocation problem was merely one of allocating a fixed supply of resources amongst alternative and competing uses. Now, generally, therefore, no explanation of the forces that determine the prices of the factors of production when the supply of these factors was not fixed. There was no explanation of this. And so, if one follows what is being advanced here, it's essentially the fact that supply of whatever particular item we are looking at, or whatever particular commodity, was assumed in the first marginalist revolution to be fixed. And so there was no explanation of the forces that determine the prices, and there was no explanation of the forces that determine the distribution of, of income. And therefore, subsequently, we know no significant analysis of the economics of the firm, something which we'll come to much later. Because if you'll pay keen attention, you'll see that in economics, particularly where you are in your studies in undergraduate degree, you will find that you speak about the notion of demand, you speak about the notion of supply, you speak about the notion of an individual supply curve or and a labor supply curve, and then you speak about them operating in the market. Now, hardly ever is emphasis placed on what occurs internally in the firm, and this, of course, is a a very late addition to economics within the grand scheme of economics, or within what is called um, in methodological analysis of economics, what is called a long trajectory of history associated with economics. And so it was Ronald Coase in 1930, I think firstly in a 1928 paper, and then later on formalized in 1936, that came up with what is known as the theory of the firm. And it is actually the basis of part of what you study in a course that you would have done in third year called industrial organization. But we see, therefore, that particular elements are observed, but we don't get the full nature of the economic interaction, and therefore no comprehensive theory was formed. And naturally, there was no insight into the unique problems that ought to be solved in developing theories to explain wages, rents, profits, and interest. Now, it is fundamental for us to understand that in any theory associated with economics, any theory at all, whether it be a marginalist theory, whether it be a Marxist theory, whether it be um, an Austrian school, whichever paradigm of economic thought we are referring to, there are two very important things that must always exist. There must always be an explanation or a theory of production and prices, or a theory of prices and production, either one that you want to put, and then a theory of the distribution of income. So, how are prices determined? How does the economy produce? And then how, firstly, how the economy produces, how are the prices set in the economy, and then the return that you obtain from from the production, the value which is garnered from that production, how is that distributed in the society? And so the first two are mutually reinforcing, because naturally, when you produce, it must have some quantum of value, which when taken in the marketplace transforms itself into a price. And then you also must have a theory of distribution, because when you move beyond the basic factors of production and you obtain the return to the factors of production, how it is distributed is very important. And so this is essentially what the marginalists in the first school of thought lacked. And what obtained in the second marginalist revolution, or the extension of the marginalist revolution, comes to underscore, underpin all of the economic theory which we utilize in that partial static equilibrium framework. And let me just see who this is. Yeah, please ensure that you're muted, right? Um, yeah, and so under under the partial static equilibrium framework, we must naturally have a method in which we explain production, a method under which we explain prices, and then a method under which we explain how the returns from these various factors of production, how they are distributed in the society. And so it takes us to an elementary, or what by now should be an elementary concept for you, which is the principle of diminishing returns. And the principle of diminishing returns, as says here, plays a fundamental role in modern economic theory. And this was first recognized in David Ricardo's contribution on particularly the agricultural production function. And The agricultural production function is one where, of course, as you and he utilized what is known popularly as the corn example. In the agricultural production function, you hold a particular quantum or a particular quantum of a factor constant, in this case the factor being land constant, and you apply various doses of capital and labor to a fixed area of land. And what essentially we see from Ricardo's original example is what you now know as the principle of diminishing returns. And naturally, I know that you would all know what this is. Uh, of course, just to recap, there is, of course, the total product curve, all right, and the total product curve reaches to a maximum point. Now, the point in which the total product curve reaches its maximum point, or the point at which production is at its maximum, equals to the point where marginal productivity of labor, or MPL, is equal to zero. All right, and this of course is very basic, very elementary. Now, once you begin to apply more and more doses of labor to the same fixed quantum of capital, or in Ricardo's case land, you begin to see that production will fall. And you can go through uh, the replete of examples that are present in and around economic theory. Take, for example, the notion of cooks in a kitchen. You can begin to extend production. You can begin to extend your output as you begin to add more persons in the kitchen. But after a particular point in time, uh, once you begin to add too much labor to the same quantum of capital, then you will find that you will naturally reduce the output. And this, of course, represents a very important relationship for us in economics, because it is this same principle of diminishing returns that actually gives us the basis uh, of the theory of distribution within the neoclassical framework. And I'll build all of this up so that you can understand why this is important within the prevailing economic context upon which the one of the first great economic revolutions in theory occurred in the 20th century. Now, naturally, this is just a basic recap of what you ought to already know, is that the slope of the total product curve um, is the first derivative of the total product curve with respect to labor. So when you take y is equal to the function of capital and labor as the general form of the production function, and then y is equal to um, or you see, this is the point where I usually would like to ask these questions. But then when you have y is equal to L plus K, and then you are going to take the first derivative of one and take the first derivative of the other. And naturally, when you take the first derivative of both, you will end up with the marginal. And when you are observing the marginal, you differentiate with respect to the other factors of production up to the point upon which they are equal to zero to be able to obtain your maximum total product. And so, how therefore, that of course naturally is elementary economics. And price of labor, therefore, how is it derived? Now, the price of labor is actually derived through the marginal physical product of labor, or what is actually being produced by labor. This is, of course, within the neoclassical framework. What is being produced by labor, and then what the product of that labor, the output of that labor, what price it carries. And so the price of labor, therefore, is equal to the output times the price of the output. And this, of course, is represented here. The price of labor being equal to the marginal physical product of labor, that is, of course, what labor is producing, times the price of the output. and that within the neoclassical framework is what is supposed to be equal to the price that labor will obtain. Now, of course, what obtains here is, let's further the example. Say the price of labor is 10,000 and the output is 12. Each unit is being sold for 1,000, and therefore you the price of labor, if we are going to pay 10,000, the value of what is being produced by labor is actually 12,000. Now, neoclassical economics will tell us that this equation continues up until the point that these two are equal. And this is the reason why you see this coming into play here, because the marginal physical product of A over the price of A is equal to the marginal physical product of B over the price of B, and this continues throughout all of the output that labor makes within its production process. This, of course, as you would have would know from elementary economics, is known as the equimarginal principle. And essentially, once the price of labor is equal to the value of the output, then if you look at it, once these two are equal, and you take the right hand side and you take it over to the left, when you subtract, your remainder will be zero. And at that point in time, you know that you are uh, fully utilizing the value of the output, and labor is being compensated for what they have produced. Now, why does this point become important as we move on in economics? So this actually is the basis for what is known as the production exhaustion theorem. And so the production exhaustion theorem is one of the linchpins in economics, because essentially that notion where each factor of production is paid according to the value that they produce is what is known as the production exhaustion theorem. And the production exhaustion theorem is the basis that provides the theory of distribution for the marginalist analysis. And with a residual theory of distribution, David Ricardo, when you go through the literature which I've provided, Landreth and Colander, you'll see that David Ricardo actually had what is known as a residual theory of distribution. And so, what wages were for Ricardo in what we call the WPR relationship, output being equal to wages plus profit plus rent, what how wages were determined in David Ricardo's construct, it was essentially a residual payment based on the remainder after profit would have been allocated to the owner of capital and rent would have been paid to the landlord. And so that is what is known as the residual theory of distribution. But with the residual theory of distribution, payments to various factors of production are equal to the total product, which is what I would have just mentioned. The output is equal to wages plus profit plus rent. And since the method of determining the payments to factors ensures that the total product is distributed, and that's what I would have just mentioned there. However, the newly developed marginal productivity theory held that each factor would receive what the marginal product of it was. All right. So remember, as I would have mentioned, Ricardo works with a residual theory, of distribution. But the marginalists propose that within the construct of the production exhaustion theorem, um, you find that each factor of production is being paid according to their output. Now, when you think about it, and you do an intellectual gloss of it, it does make sense because it appears also to be more ethical than what Ricardo's analysis puts forward or advances, simply because when wages are being treated as residual in Ricardo's theory of distribution, according to the marginal productivity theory and the production and exhaustion theorem, each person or each unit of labor or each factor of production rather is being paid in accordance with their marginal productivity. And so if we go through a very basic example, the quantity or the output would be equal to the marginal physical product of labor times the amount of labor which is applied plus the marginal physical product of T, let's say T being land, all right? And so when you take this to find what the value of it is, you'll multiply straight through the entire equation by P, and so PQ is equal to P times MPPL times L, all right? Which when you think about what you are doing here logically, and the same applies to land, but when you think about what you're doing here logically, you're taking the output of labor, all right, the marginal physical product of labor, and multiplying it by the number of laborers that are working, and then multiplying their output by the price. And when you do that, what you will end up with throughout this is known as the value of marginal product. And so the PQ, or the price times quantity, which is essentially going to give you the value of your output, is equal to the value of the marginal product of labor times labor plus the value of the marginal product of land times the amount of land. And when you look at what this essentially is, the left side of the equation will give you your total revenue, and the right side of the equation will give you the total cost. And so if one uh, knows the profit maximization condition, one would note that TR being equal to TC is the profit maximizing uh, condition. And so this, however, works only when the production function is homogeneous to degree 1. Now, when the production function is not homogeneous to degree 1, is when it's being approached mathematically. We say homogeneous to degree 1 to represent in economics constant returns to scale. But the if the production function is greater than 1, all right, or if it is less than 1, so if the production function is homogeneous to greater than degree 1 or less than degree 1, you will end up with increasing returns to scale or and decreasing average costs. If it is less than 1, then you end up with decreasing returns to scale and increasing average costs. Now, when you think about this and you try to map out mentally what is happening there, you will think about what is known, of course, as your long run average cost curve. All right. Um, so I'll just continue here. Now, for our purposes, it's not necessary. This, of course, is contributed by J.B. Clark, a very important marginalist scholar. Now, it is not necessary for us within our context to expand completely on the marginal productivity theory and explore it in its intimate detail. But the relevant point for us is that the conclusion that he comes to is that under perfectly competitive markets, each factor of production would receive equal to the value of its marginal product. And therefore, this gives us or provides us with a very important theory of distribution. Now, this return measures the contribution of a factor both to the particular product being produced and the society. And therefore, you are being judged in your production process as well as in your society that you exist in based on the value of what you are producing. Now, Clark's conclusion is that the distribution of income that results from this structure, which is of course applies on the perfectly competitive markets, is an ethically correct distribution. And when we say ethically correct, we're invoking the fact that you are giving people what they deserve, and therefore it ought to be something that is ethical. So, ethical in the sense that it rewards the factors of production according to their economic contributions to the social product. And therefore, if you are contributing to the society of X quantum uh, as a result of your production process, you will be paid to the value of X. And so when you work that out in the logical framework provided in economics and even in a general sense, that ought to make sense. Now, theories of exploitation um, and unearned incomes are for J.B. Clark naive. um, he contends, of course, because they fail to understand the working of market forces in an economy. So Clark is essentially advancing that those persons who say that laborers are being exploited and persons are not earning the types of or the amount of income that they ought to earn, those persons are naive because they don't understand the working of the market forces, which is essentially what he advanced with his production exhaustion theorem. And so the theory which we're observing here, the production exhaustion theorem, is one which is supposed to inform and substance explain the workings of the market economy, both from a production side as well as a distribution side. And the ethical conclusions that he drew as a result of the marginal productivity theory which he advanced have actually attracted much more critical attention than his contributions in solving the production exhaustion theorem. Now, um, this equation here, of course, is is worked out in its intimate form by a scholar in the in the second marginalist revolution, known as Wicksteed, and he utilizes Leonard Euler's theorem. Uh, for those of you who are interested, and I rather suggest actually that you review in detail Euler's theorem, um, and you go through the marginal productivity theory and the production exhaustion theorem. I'll send the link to something uh, that you can go through just to begin to understand or to complete your understanding of what it is that they were saying. But what are the criticisms, or what were the criticisms which were levied against him um, for this production exhaustion theorem? Now, there is an entire construct that criticizes the ethical conclusions which he claims that he draws from it. Now, the most important problem with this argument is that it's a violation of David Hume's dictum. And is that what is Hume's dictum? Hume's dictum is that you ought not to draw an ethical implication from a non ethical analysis. And so, within a framework of mathematics and positivism in economics, you are dealing within a framework of a natural science where numbers are representing a construct in abstraction. But what J.B. Clark attempted to do was draw an ethical implication from the production exhaustion theorem, which in and of itself is a mathematical construct because it's based on Leonard Euler's uh, theorem, and he draws ethical implications as a result. So what a person should earn, which is a normative consideration, will have little relation to what he or she actually earns. All right. And this is what the marginal productivity theory and the production exhaustion theorem more specifically is telling us, is that this person should be earning their marginal product or the value of their marginal product of labor. But in reality, that may not exist. And an individual's income will depend on the price of the factors he or she sells in the market and the quantity of the factors sold. Individuals who own capital and land, so the owners of K and T, will receive incomes from these sources, but these payments represent the contribution of the factors and not the individuals. Now, this, of course, is the same thing that applies to labor, and we'll see in a bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But Clark's ethical conclusions, therefore, is that is the reliance on perfectly competitive markets. Clark was aware of the monopoly power of both firms and labor unions and tried to address its influence on the distribution of income and on his ethical conclusions. Now, one of the most important things for the marginal productivity theory is that it actually provides a framework for the theory of employment. And that is essentially what you would have been studying throughout your entire labor economics 1. Now, marginal productivity as a theory of employment and a marginal productivity analysis was originally developed to explain the forces which would have determined the prices of factors of production and the distribution of income. Remember, when we started, we were essentially saying that you have to be able to explain the prices of the factors of production, and the distribution of income. So the marginal productivity analysis actually was supposed to provide a framework for that. However, it was soon believed that the theory could be applied to the forces determining the level of employment. Now, naturally, that would be a logical conclusion, because if you are able to explain one particular market using this framework, then we would tend to believe that we can use it right across once you have a solid framework. And in the theory of employment, according to marginal productivity, and this is something which you already know, when you draw your curves and so on, you are really familiar with it. What I'm going to say is that in the partial equilibrium analytical framework, the partial static equilibrium framework, if the price of labor is increased, what happens? A firm will hire less labor until the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the higher price of labor. And that is, of course, when we go back to our previous slides and you work that out, all right, if the price of labor is increased, the firm will hire less labor until the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the higher price of labor. And so, therefore, you ought to lower what your price is, or the price of labor is, until it is equal to that value of the marginal product. And hiring less labor will result in an increase in the marginal physical product of labor, and thus in the value of the marginal product of labor. And that's very, very basic. Now, at industry level, the price of labor will depend upon the demand for labor, which is derived from the value of the marginal product of labor and the supply of labor. And so, essentially, what that is saying there is that the price that is being paid for labor within a particular industry will depend upon demand and supply in that labor market. And if the price of labor in that particular industry. So just envision right now in your mind the supply of labor and the demand for labor, both the supply and the demand curve existing in the labor market. If the price of labor is above the equilibrium, what will happen? You will have your supply curve and you'll have your demand curve. And at that point in time, that is above the equilibrium, the quantity of labor supplied will exceed the quantity of labor demanded. And therefore, you will have a surplus of labor or unemployment. And so this here for the marginal analysts, or for those who um, followed the marginalist revolution, the price of labor going above equilibrium was anything that occurred, anything that caused that or caused that to occur created a major problem. And this essentially is what you would have learned throughout your labor economics one. You have your demand and supply curve. It comes to an equilibrium point, and when you have things like unions and other factors that keep price of labor artificially higher than the equilibrium point, that you would end up with a situation of uh, unemployment, and you would end up with a situation of uh, or not an equilibrium situation. Now, logically, using our partial static equilibrium framework and thinking through it as economists with that framework, it makes sense. However, when you think about it within the context of macroeconomic policy, what policy conclusions therefore ought to be drawn? And you would have done this throughout your entire first course. The conclusion which is drawn from this theory is that depressions and unemployment could be eliminated by permitting wages to fall. Now, this would of course be done through um, lowering any artificial wages or facilitating any lowering of the artificial wages. And of course that means removing what is known as institutional rigidities that would prevent wages from falling. All right. Or alternatively, another thing that can be done to cause this is actually inward migration of labor, which would then create a more competitive situation and bid labor prices down. All right. So, although some economists were reluctant on social grounds to advocate for lowering wages to remove unemployment and cure depressions, there is little doubt that orthodox theory came to these conclusions. And this essentially was the theory that was prevailing um, during the 1930s, subsequent to the uh, the uh, fall of the stock market in October 29th, 1929, when you had the great collapse during the end of that decade. That decade, of course, known as the Roaring Twenties, will lead into the 1930s, which, of course, is the Great Depression. Now, J.R. Hicks, who is another um, great contributor to economics, of course, you would know him from uh, the a number of things, including the Hicks-Hansen curve, which is what you would have studied in macroeconomics. Uh, but he concluded that artificially setting wages above competitive equilibrium wages, either because of union pressure or legislation, would result in unemployment. And the unemployment must go on until the artificial wages are relaxed or until competitive wages have risen to the artificial level. And therefore, what these scholars are articulating here is that there is some natural equilibrium that occurs in the economy, in the labor market, where if you move out of that natural equilibrium, you end up in a situation that is less than optimal or suboptimal. And therefore, they can only see unemployment being as a result of one, temporary disequilibrium in the labor markets, or two, impediments that prevent wages from falling. And so when we think about this within a practical sense, a temporary disequilibrium in the labor market can occur because of mass frictional unemployment occurring, seasonal unemployment. You can, of course, also have movements in the business cycle that would change the output. Um, and then the other category would be what I would have referred to earlier as being institutional rigidities or institutional impediments that would prevent wages from falling. It, of course, would include unionism and union bargaining, um, minimum wage and minimum wage being legislated, and anything that would essentially prevent wages from falling. But the marginal productivity theory, coupled with the strong laissez faire market orientation, led particularly American economists to suggest that the best policy to alleviate the depression during the early 1930s was to keep the government out of the economy and let the market work to lower wages. Now, when you think practically, and I'll send some documentaries for you to go through, but when you think practically about what that is saying, you're essentially saying that once wages begin to fall, that the depression will be cured. That somehow, once persons begin to receive lower wages, that or they move back to that natural equilibrium, or they move away from what is being termed here as these artificial wages, and they are relaxed to the point of competitive wages. Once you have that occurring, that you will somehow end up in a state of equilibrium. Now, when we follow our logic that is articulated here in the production exhaustion theorem, and in the marginalist analysis, it does make sense, all right, because otherwise you are dealing in a state of unemployment. But markets do not occur in isolation, and so we cannot view the labor market as being one which occurred in isolation. Now, what is it that makes the labor market so particularly different or so peculiar from commodity markets? And this is the main point that they would have missed in the marginalist analysis, is that the very same wages that are paid to laborers to ensure, as a result of their work, it is that very same wage that is paid that creates the demand in the economy for the goods and services that are supplied. And so this is where the notion of Say's law and the destruction of Say's law as a result of Maynard Keynes comes into play. Because what I just articulated to you, remember, Say's law provides a theoretical framework where supply or whatever is being produced in the economy, well, of course, you know Say's law, all right? Anyone? What? Let me just perhaps get you involved here at this point. Miko McIntosh, what is Say's law?
All right, so sales laws we said in supply creates its own demand.
Correct. Supply creates its own demand. All right, and therefore we see Say's law being invoked to explain that supply, whatever is being produced, that supply will create its own demand. But if you work on a basis of pushing wages down, then who will demand or who will have the money to purchase the goods that are being produced? And therefore, Maynard Keynes recognizes this, and he advances something called the theory of effectual demand, which we will get to when we reach to him, which essentially upturns Say's law and states that demand instead is what creates the supply. Because without persons being paid wages, you will not get aggregate demand. And without aggregate demand, you will not have anybody to purchase goods and services. And so Keynes himself, in his great revolution, and Keynes, I must say, I personally admire his out of the box thinking. For those of you who are interested, you should read his autobiography by Robert Skidelsky, John Maynard Keynes. A fascinating work. Um, Keynes himself upturns economic theory because he changes this entire construct where you are now thinking about supply creating its own demand, and instead demand creating its own supply. Further to that, it was always thought that anyone who was unemployed was voluntarily unemployed. But Keynes says, hey, you are saying in your articulation that for the market to work, and look, it's right here, let the market work to lower wages. But therefore, how do we explain the person who is willing to work for the absolute lowest wage during the Great Depression? The absolute lowest wage, let's say it's one single Guyana dollar, for example, per day. And the person is willing to work for that, but there are no jobs available, or the person is not being hired. How much lower does wage fall? And when I forward to you the documentary, you'll have a clear understanding of the fact that people were just willing to work, but there were no jobs. And therefore, one really must question whether that notion of everyone being who is unemployed is voluntarily unemployed, or if there is the question of what is called involuntary unemployment. Now, remember that the marginalists fundamentally, we're not talking here about frictional unemployment, because they identified that there would be periods of frictional unemployment that exist within an economy from persons moving from job to job. Here, what Maynard Keynes is talking about is something that is more structural and fundamental in nature. And so, um, what were the criticisms, therefore, of marginal productivity as a theory of employment? It was twofold. On the first basis, it was technical. All right. Now, technical in the sense that production functions, as we would have gone through, they ought they were assumed to be homogeneous to the first degree, which would grant us the notion in economics as constant returns to scale. That is, as you increase one unit of input, you would have one unit of output. Now, we know that constant returns to scale is something that does not exist within the actual world, and therefore Wicksteed's entire construct in solving the production exhaustion theorem based on that assumption cannot yield something that is applicable in the real world. And the production function is such that it yields a U-shaped long run average cost curve. And therefore, once you have an average cost curve that is U-shaped, it cannot have that assumption of constant returns to scale being applied. And the U shape of the long run average cost curve implies that you have, for one portion of the cost curve, increasing returns to scale. And then after a particular point, which of course is known as your economies of scale point, or in business economics, you refer to it as your um, minimum efficient scale point. After that point, you end up with diminishing returns to scale. And so we see from a fundamental point of view that what the framework that is being used, the partial static equilibrium framework that is being used to analyze that labor market, um, and you are drawing policy conclusions as a result of it, the technical basis of it can be destroyed. But the final output, some more issues with it, or technical criticisms, is that the final output for a firm, industry, or an economy is the result of a joint effort of labor, land, and capital, and it is impossible, said critics of the marginal productivity theory, it is impossible to separate the marginal products of the contributing factors because labor does not contribute independent of land. He doesn't sit in the air and contribute. He works on the land. He does not sit aside or in an environment that is vacuous of the contribution of capital, and therefore there is a certain degree of complementarity that exists between the factors of production, which causes the output as a result. And so, as we continue along the line of the technical criticisms, on the constant returns to scale, which is, of course, what was assumed, the long run average cost curve of a firm, if you would remember from your intermediate microeconomics, the long run average cost curve of a firm under the conditions of constant returns to scale is a horizontal straight line. And a horizontal straight line under those conditions is incompatible with the notion of perfect competition. Why is that? Well, of course, I'll leave you to go delve into your microeconomics book to go see that. And essentially, this notion was made by a Harvard professor very early on in the economic discourse, that we can disengage no concretely separable product of labor and capital. Essentially, you cannot say that labor has produced without capital and capital has produced without labor. And as a result of that inalienable construct that exists between the factors of production or amongst the factors of production, you cannot speak definitively to marginality being invoked to explain wages as a return on the factor of production of labor. So that is on the technical side. On the policy side, when we track back, what they were essentially advocating for was a do nothing approach by a government during an economic recession, because essentially what you are seeing there is that these theorists are telling the government, do nothing, leave a laissez-faire approach, and the market will correct itself during an economic recession. Now, this, of course, we know can never be the best thing to do. Of course, Frederick von Hayek, or Friedrich Hayek as he is popularly known, the leader of the Austrian school and later Nobel Prize winner, um, he's also the author of a very good book called The Road to Serfdom, written in 1944. You should perhaps have a read of that. Um, contends that Keynesian theory, the theory of John Maynard Keynes, only temporarily masked the uh, issues which he said were underlying during the Great Recession, during the Great Depression, rather, not the Great Recession. That was 2008. Um, and he actually advocated that governments should not have done anything for a longer period of time and permitted the economy to do what he called self-purging, all right, to be able to reach to its optimal point again. Of course, um, needless to say, that did not appear attractive to policymakers who do not exist in a an abstract framework. They exist within a society. they obviously have to be voted in through a democratic means. And if the people believe that the government is not acting, then there is some amount of self-interest associated, in the sense that the theory of voting must apply, and persons will act in the interest that maximizes. Political actors will act in the best interest of maximizing their votes. And so, within a practical policy environment, that does not lend itself to being a proper approach. Now, when we think about what uh, Keynes would have done, Keynes actually rescued economic theory from collapsing on itself, because based on the marginalist analysis and everything that I would have just presented to you and everything that you would have learned during your labor economics one, this was what the policy approach would be based on your partial static equilibrium framework and that analysis of the labor market. A do nothing approach during an economic recession or during an economic depression. Uh, and so, what we shall endeavor to do substantially is go through the work of Maynard Keynes and see where, when, where and when the marginalists were wrong, how he changed economic thinking, how the change that Maynard Keynes invoked centrally revolved around labor. And we see that the economic depression, the Great Depression during that time, was not a crisis that was absent or abstract of labor, but one where labor itself was a central feature of the Great Depression, and how what Keynes calls solving the crisis of labor actually helps to lift the economy out of depression and solves the Great Depression. And so that, of course, will be the construct for next class. That will be an overview of what we'll do. I'll endeavor to send the I'll endeavor to send the uh, videos, the documentaries for you, and we will go through that. Please ensure that you review it, because we will be going through that. I want you to have a proper contextual understanding of the Great Depression, so that you can understand two things. One, the condition under which Maynard Keynes' work emerges, and then secondly, the prevailing social context within which he was forced to analyze. And so, with that, I think I'll perhaps stop here and I'll ask if any questions based on what I would have said.